wind scoured the Montana plain, biting through thin coats. Eliza, 12, jaw set against the cold and the world, clutched her brother Jonah's, 8, trembling hand. Behind them stretched miles of emptiness, the orphanage a bitter memory already swallowed by dusk. Before them, a sagging cabin, smoke a fragile promise curling from its chimney. Jonah's silent tears froze on his cheeks. Eliza lifted a fist, knuckles raw and knocked. The sound echoed in the vast, freezing quiet. Inside, a shadow moved. Light bled around the doorframe. Eliza swallowed hard. The plea rehearsed 100 desperate miles forming on her lips. "We got kicked from the orphanage, ma'am, sir. Can we sleep here? Just for tonight?" She braced, feeling Jonah shrink against her leg. Through the weathered wood, she sensed stillness, the heavy quiet of a place holding its breath, holding its pain. Would the door open to warmth, or slam shut like every hope they'd ever had? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The door didn't slam. It opened just enough to frame a woman's face, etched by wind and time, eyes wide with surprise that quickly clouded with a deeper, older caution. Martha. Behind her, the cabin's interior glowed, firelight flickering on rough-hewn logs, the smell of stew and wood smoke thick and almost painful after the barren cold. The air escaping was warm, carrying the faint scent of lye soap and dust. Orphanage. Martha's voice was low, roughened like creek stone. Eliza pushed Jonah slightly behind her, shielding him with her own thin frame. Her chin lifted, defiance warring with the exhaustion dragging at her bones. St. Agatha's, over near Helena Way, said we were too much trouble. Her gaze flickered past Martha, scanning the dim room. Sparse, clean, a rocking chair by the hearth empty, a worn quilt draped over settle. Shadows clung deep in the corners. We won't stay long, just shelter from the cold. Her voice cracked on the last word. Jonah pressed his face in her coat, his small body rigid with silent terror. A deeper shadow shifted behind Martha. A man, Amos, broad-shouldered but stooped, materialized in the doorway beside his wife. His face was a landscape of hard lines beneath a thick, grizzled beard. His eyes, a startling pale blue, swept over the children. Eliza's desperate bravado, Jonah's near-invisible fragility, the rags barely clinging to them, the dust of the road ground into their worn boots. His gaze lingered on the boy, then snapped back to Eliza. He didn't speak, just looked. The wind moaned around the cabin corners, rattling the loose shutter on the single window. Too much trouble, Martha repeated softly, almost to herself. Her eyes, a faded brown, held a sorrow so deep it seemed part of her marrow. They drifted for a fraction of a second towards the darkest corner of the room, where a low doorway stood shut tight, a heavy iron key protruding from its lock. Then back to the children, to Jonah's matted hair, Eliza's chapped lips, the raw, red knuckles where she'd knocked. "Come in," she said, the words pulled from some hidden well of memory. "Before the cold takes you." Amos grunted, a sound without clear meaning. He stepped back, making space, his bulk blocking the firelight momentarily. Eliza hesitated. Every instinct screamed caution. Doorways led to worse places too often. But Jonah was shivering violently now, a tremor she felt through her own bones. The warmth beckoned, a siren song against the howling dark outside. She tightened her grip on Jonah's hand, a silent command, and nudged him forward over the threshold. She followed, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the room like a trapped animal. The rifle above the mantel, the heavy iron poker by the hearth, the closed door. The warmth was a physical blow. Eliza swayed. Jonah made a small, choked sound, burying his face deeper against her. "Sit." Martha gestured towards the settle near the fire. "Get some warmth into you." She moved to the blackened stove, ladling stew into 2 chipped enamel bowls. The smell was overwhelming. Eliza's stomach clenched painfully. She guided Jonah to the settle, sitting stiffly beside him, refusing to let go of his hand. He curled into her side, eyes huge and watchful, fixed on Amos, who stood near the locked door, arms crossed, observing them with that unnerving stillness. Martha brought the bowls, steaming, rich with chunks of meat and root vegetables Eliza couldn't name. "Eat," Martha urged, placing them on a low stool before the settle. "Slowly now. It's hot." Eliza stared at the food. "Too much. A trick?" She picked up a spoon, her hand trembling slightly. She dipped it, blew on a piece of potato, then offered it to Jonah. His lips parted obediently. He swallowed, a flicker of life returning to his eyes. Only then did Eliza take a tiny spoonful for herself. The flavor exploded, rich and savory, almost making her dizzy. She forced herself to eat slowly, mechanically, her gaze constantly darting between Martha tending the stove and Amos, a silent sentinel by the wall. "Kicked out," Amos stated finally. Not a question, a fact laid bare. His voice was gravel scraping stone. "What trouble?" Eliza froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. Jonah flinched, pressing closer. Eliza lowered the spoon, her knuckles whitening on the handle. "Didn't fit," she muttered, staring into the stew. So he talked back. "Jonah don't talk much. Not since..." She bit off the words. "Just didn't fit. They wanted docile." She lifted her chin again, meeting Amos's pale eyes. "We ain't docile." A ghost of something, not a smile, perhaps recognition, flickered in Amos's eyes. He uncrossed his arms, walked to the hearth, and picked up a worn leather strop and a hunting knife. He began methodically drawing the blade across the leather. Scritch, scritch. The rhythmic sound filled the silence, strangely comforting, yet underscored by tension. "Place like that," he said, not looking up. "Docile gets you nowhere. Or worse." Martha wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze soft on Jonah, who was now eating hesitantly on his own, his eyes fixed on the fire. "How long you been walking?" she asked gently. 3 days, Eliza said, "since they put us out the gate. Gave us nothing." She remembered the matron's cold eyes. "Trouble. Bad blood, like your father. No can wants you. Be gone." The memory was a fresh bruise. "Slept in a barn last night. Man chased us off with a shotgun before dawn." Martha made a soft, sympathetic noise deep in her throat. She moved towards the locked door, hesitated, then turned towards a heavy oak chest instead. She lifted the lid, the hinges groaning, and pulled out 2 thick, gray woolen blankets. They smelled faintly of cedar. "You'll sleep here tonight," she said, laying the blankets over the back of the rocking chair near the fire. "By the warmth." Amos stopped stropping the knife. He looked at Martha, a long, silent exchange passing between them. Questions, doubts, the weight of their own quiet, grief-haunted years pressing in against this sudden, fragile intrusion. Martha held his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. A silent plea. Amos looked back at the children, Eliza's wary exhaustion, Jonah's profound silence. He gave a single, slow nod, barely perceptible, agreement or resignation. "Thank you, ma'am," Eliza whispered, the words thick in her throat. Relief warred with a deeper unease. Kindness was a currency rarely spent without expectation. "We'll be gone first light. Won't be a burden. No one's rushing you," Martha said, her voice firming. She knelt by the chest again, pulling out a small tin. "Got some salve for those hands." She held it out. Eliza hesitated, then reached out, taking the tin. The metal was cool. "Thank you." She unscrewed the lid. The smell of herbs and beeswax filled the air. She dipped a finger in the greasy ointment and gently took Jonah's smaller hand. He watched, passive, as she smoothed the salve over his cracked knuckles. She did her own next, the sting momentarily sharp, then soothing. The simple act, the unexpected care, threatened to unravel the tight knot of control inside her. She focused on Jonah's hand, the delicate bones beneath her fingers. Martha watched them, her own hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze drifted again, involuntarily, towards the locked door. A room untouched for years. Dust motes danced in the firelight near its threshold. Amos followed her look, his jaw tightening. He picked up the poker and nudged a log deeper into the flames, sending sparks swirling up the chimney like fleeing stars. Later, when Jonah had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled under one blanket on the settle, his breathing shallow but even, Eliza remained awake. Martha had retreated to the kitchen area, washing bowls with quiet efficiency. Amos sat in the rocking chair, whittling a piece of pine, the shavings falling in soft curls onto the hearthstones. The fire crackled, the only sound besides the relentless wind outside. Eliza pretended to sleep, watching through slitted eyes. Her hand crept to the worn leather satchel she'd kept tucked beside her on the settle. It held little: a tinderbox, a stub of candle, a worn handkerchief, and the only thing of value she possessed. Her fingers brushed the cold metal shape hidden deep inside the lining, beneath a loose stitch she'd sewn herself. A locket, silver, tarnished almost black. Inside, a tiny, blurred daguerreotype, a man with dark, intense eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. Her father, the man whose name, whispered even in the orphanage, had brought trouble down on them. The man whose shadow still hunted them. She felt the sharp edge of the locket dig into her palm. Proof. Danger. A past that wouldn't let go. Martha finished washing up. She dried her hands, her movements slow, thoughtful. Her eyes rested on the sleeping Jonah. His face finally relaxed in the firelight, then lifted to Eliza's feigned sleep. Compassion warred with a growing, unspoken question. What burden had they truly taken in? She moved quietly towards the settle, not to wake them, just to adjust the blanket slipping from Jonah's shoulder. As she leaned down, the toe of her worn boot nudged the leather satchel lying on the floor beside Eliza. It tipped, not much, just enough. The loose stitch Eliza had sewn caught on a splinter in the rough-hewn floorboard. A tiny, sharp rip. The flap of the hidden pocket inside gaped open. Martha, straightening the blanket, glanced down. Her hand paused midair. Firelight glinted dully on something metallic spilled partly from the satchel's torn lining. Not a coin. Too large. Too ornate for orphans with nothing. She bent closer, her shadow falling across the object. A locket, old silver, and etched crudely, unmistakably on its tarnished face, even in the flickering light. A coiled rattlesnake. Martha's breath hitched. A tiny, sharp intake of air. Her eyes, wide with sudden, dawning horror, snapped up to Eliza's face. Eliza, caught, her own eyes wide open now, frozen in the act of pretending sleep, saw the recognition, the fear flood Martha's features. It was the symbol, the one whispered about in the saloons her father had frequented, the brand of Silas Rourke, the most ruthless claim jumper and land pirate in the territory. A man known for leaving no witnesses. A man her father had crossed. Outside, beyond the thin walls of the cabin, a horse whinnied. Not one of Amos's sturdy workhorses in the lean-to. A stranger's horse. Close. Too close. Amos was already on his feet, the whittling knife clenched in his fist, his pale eyes like chips of ice fixed on the shuttered window. The wind carried a new sound now, beneath its moan. The soft, deliberate crunch of boots on the frozen ground, circling the cabin. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, brittle as ice. Martha's gasp hung frozen in the air. Her eyes, wide with a horror Eliza didn't fully comprehend but instinctively feared, locked onto the exposed locket. On the tarnished silver, the coiled rattlesnake seemed to writhe in the firelight. Crunch. The sound outside, deliberate, circling, sliced through the stillness. Amos was a shadow detaching from the wall, the whittling knife now held low and ready, his pale eyes fixed on the shuttered window. His other hand gestured sharply towards Martha. Down. Quiet. Martha moved without thought, decades of frontier instinct overriding shock. Her hand darted out, not to snatch the locket, but to swiftly push the torn flap of the satchel's lining back over it, hiding the dreadful symbol. She met Eliza's terrified gaze. There was no time for questions, no time for accusations. Only the immediate, shared threat. Martha pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes conveying a desperate plea for silence, then jerked her head towards Jonah, still mercifully asleep on the settle. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knows. Oh God, she knows. Panic warred with a primal urge to protect Jonah. She froze, coiled tight, every sense screaming. The locket felt like a brand against her skin through the leather. Proof of her father's fatal mistake. Proof that Silas Rourke's shadow stretched long and lethal, even here. Crunch, crunch. Closer now, near the front window. A pause. The scrape of a boot sole on the frozen porch plank. Amos eased silently towards the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. His breath fogged faintly in the frigid air leaking through the cracks. Martha crouched low beside the settle, her hand hovering protectively near Jonah's head, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. Rourke. The name echoed in her mind, dredging up half-whispered tales of claim jumping, burned-out homesteads, and men vanished without a trace. A man without mercy. What had these children tangled with? The silence outside stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then, the crunch of boots receding, moving away from the cabin, fading gradually into the moaning wind. The tension didn't break. It settled, heavy and suffocating, like the snow-laden clouds pressing down on the homestead. Amos waited a full 5 minutes, motionless at the door, listening to the wind reclaim the night. Finally, he lowered the knife a fraction, his shoulders relaxing minutely. Gone, he rasped the word rough. For now. Martha slowly straightened, her legs trembling. Her eyes went first to Jonah, undisturbed in his exhausted sleep, then to Eliza. The girl hadn't moved, her face pale, eyes huge and dark with fear and defiance. Martha saw the tremor in her hands, the way she subtly shifted to shield her satchel. The unspoken question hung thick between them. What have you brought to our door? Who? Martha managed, her voice barely a whisper. Eliza flinched. Don't know. She lied, the words scraping out. Just someone. Maybe followed us from the road. Her gaze flickered towards the satchel, then away, guilty. We'll leave. First light. Like I said, Amos moved away from the door, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering on a locked door in the corner, then landing heavily on Martha. A silent conversation passed between them, laden with years of shared grief and the sudden, terrifying disruption of their fragile peace. Martha saw the questions, the fear mirroring her own, but also a stubborn set to his jaw. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not yet. Sit down, girl, Amos ordered, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier sharp edge. Nobody's going out in that dark, cold or no cold. Not with visitors about. He walked to the window, lifted the edge of the shutter a crack, and peered out into the blackness. Snow swirled in the dim light escaping the cabin. Martha, bank the fire. We'll keep it low. The night passed in a suffocating vigil. Eliza didn't sleep. She sat rigidly on the edge of the settle, Jonah's head in her lap, her hand resting protectively on the satchel. Every creak of the cabin settling, every moan of the wind was the stranger returning. Martha moved quietly, adding a log now and then, her movements stiff with unspoken dread. She couldn't banish the image of the coiled snake. Silas Rourke, a ghost from the territory's darkest corners, now haunting her hearth. Why children? What had their father done? The locked room across from her seemed to pulse with its own silent accusation. Amos sat in the rocking chair, the rifle now across his knees, his gaze fixed on the shuttered windows. His thoughts were grim tracks in the snow. Trouble, bad trouble, the kind that didn't leave survivors. He remembered the rumors, Rourke's mark left on disputed claims, on the bodies of those who opposed him. Taking these children in wasn't just charity anymore. It was painting a target on their backs. Yet, looking at the boy's pale face, slack in sleep, the girl's fierce, exhausted vigilance, sending them back into the night was a death sentence he couldn't stomach. Not yet. Martha's silent plea by the fire echoed his own conflicted heart. Dawn crept in, gray and reluctant, filtering through the shutters. The wind had lessened, leaving a brittle cold and a fresh blanket of snow, pristine and deceptive, covering the tracks of the night. Amos rose stiffly, his joints protesting. "Stay inside," he told Martha, his voice low. "Keep the door barred. I'll check the stock." Eliza watched him pull on his heavy coat and hat, pick up the rifle, and slip out the door, closing it firmly behind him. The bar thudded into place. The sound echoed in the quiet cabin. Martha busied herself rebuilding the fire, the clatter of the iron poker loud in the stillness. Jonah stirred, whimpering softly, his eyes fluttering open, filled with immediate, silent confusion and fear. Eliza shushed him gently, smoothing his hair, her own nerves frayed raw. Martha brought over bowls of thin oatmeal. Eliza took hers mechanically, her eyes never leaving Martha's face. The woman's movements were careful, deliberate, but her eyes, they held a new weight, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. She looked at Eliza, then Jonah, with a mixture of pity and a deep, unsettling wariness. "Your father," Martha began, her voice carefully neutral as she stirred her own oatmeal. "He got into trouble before the orphanage." Eliza's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. Her heart leapt in her throat. She knows. She knows about the locket. She knows about Rourke. Defiance flared, hot and protective. "He's dead," she stated flatly, the words like stones. "Died when Jonah was little. Got sick." It was half the truth, wrapped in a hard shell. She wouldn't speak of the accusations, the midnight flight, the men who came asking after her father vanished. Trouble, bad blood. The orphanage matron's words were branded on her soul. "Sick," Martha repeated softly. Her gaze drifted towards the locked door again, a gesture so habitual, so laden with unspoken sorrow, it was impossible to miss. "Sickness takes many forms." She paused, then added, almost to herself, "Sometimes it leaves marks long after." Eliza followed her gaze, the locked door suddenly more than just a barrier. It felt like a secret, a parallel grief. "What's in there?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Martha flinched as if struck. She looked down at her bowl, her knuckles white on the spoon. "Nothing," she whispered, the word thick with pain. "Just things from before." She took a shaky breath. "Our boy, Caleb, he took the fever. Winter of '73. That was his room." The name hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. 10 years of grief, named aloud for the first time in this tense, fragile space. Jonah flinched violently at the sudden scrape of Martha's chair as she stood up abruptly, turning away to hide the tears welling in her eyes. The sound, sharp and unexpected, seemed to pierce his silent world. He whimpered a high, thin sound and scrambled back against Eliza, burying his face in her side, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Not just fear now, but a deeper terror triggered by the noise, by the raw emotion vibrating in the room. "Shoo, Jonah," Eliza murmured, pulling him close, rocking him slightly. "It's okay. Just a chair. Just a chair." She glared at Martha's back, a fierce protectiveness surging. "He don't like loud noises," she said, her voice tight. "Not since..." She bit her lip, refusing to say more. Not since the men came shouting, since the gunshots in the dark. The unspoken words screamed in the silence. Martha wiped her eyes fiercely with her apron. Shame warred with her own grief and fear. "I'm sorry, Jonah," she said, her voice rough with unshed tears. "Didn't mean to frighten you." She took a deep, steadying breath, turning back towards them, her expression softened by shared pain, momentarily eclipsing the fear of Rourke. "It's just hard, sometimes." Later, Amos returned, stomping snow from his boots on the porch before entering. His face was grim. "Tracks," he announced, hanging his coat. "One horse." Rode right up to the west window, circled the cabin, headed back towards the bluffs. He didn't look at the children, didn't try the barn or the lean-to, just looked. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. Eliza felt Jonah tense against her. He was watching. "He knows we're here. Fresh snow covered and mostly," Amos continued, moving to the fire to warm his hands. "But clear enough." He glanced at Martha, a silent communication passing between them. The threat was real, tangible. "Need to check the fence line. Snow's deep, but the stock's restless." He seemed to hesitate, then looked at Jonah, still clinging to Eliza. "Boy," he said, his voice surprisingly not unkind. "Need a strong back to help carry feed sacks from a barn. Light ones. You up for it?" Jonah looked up, startled, his eyes wide. He glanced at Eliza, seeking permission, reassurance. Eliza nodded slowly, wary but seeing no malice in Amos's weathered face. Maybe work would distract him. Jonah uncurled himself, standing hesitantly. Amos handed him a pair of worn, but clean, wool mittens Martha had dug out earlier. "Keep them hands warm." Watching Jonah follow Amos out into the bright, cold morning, bundled in an old coat of Amos's that swallowed him whole, Martha felt a treacherous flicker of warmth. The boy's silent determination, the way Amos slowed his long stride to match Jonah's small steps. It was normal, a sliver of life piercing the dread. With the men outside, the cabin felt different. The tension eased slightly, replaced by a fragile domesticity. Martha began tidying, her movements purposeful, trying to banish the lingering fear. She needed to clean, to impose order on the chaos swirling inside. She moved towards the heavy oak chest where the blankets had been stored. As she lifted the lid, the familiar cedar scent rose. She reached in to straighten the folded quilts inside. Her fingers brushed something stiff and unfamiliar tucked deep in the corner, beneath the bottom quilt. Not fabric, leather, worn smooth. She pulled it out. A small, flat tobacco pouch. Not Amos's. He chewed twist and kept it in his pocket. This was old, the leather dry and cracked. She hadn't opened this chest properly in years, not since Caleb. Curiosity warred with a growing sense of unease. She loosened the drawstring and tipped the pouch. A few dried, useless flakes of tobacco fell out. And something else. A small, tarnished brass button and a folded, brittle piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The ink was faded, the handwriting a rough scrawl she didn't recognize. "Amos, heard you filed on the west quarter by Black Creek. Pretty piece. Too pretty for a sodbuster. Consider this a friendly warning. Find easier dirt. S.R." Martha's blood ran cold. S.R. Silas Rourke. The west quarter, the parcel Amos had been so proud of securing back in '71, the year before Caleb was born. The parcel they'd been forced to abandon when Caleb fell ill and the medical bills mounted, when grief sapped their strength to fight the harsh land and its harsher predators. Amos had never spoken of why they left that promising plot so suddenly, only that it weren't meant to be. He'd come home one day, white-faced and grim, pack their essential belongings onto the wagon, and move them to this more barren, less desirable spot within the week. He'd buried the failure, buried the fear, along with their son. Rourke, he'd threatened them. Years ago, driven them off their claim with a note tucked in their door, just like the one she held now. Amos had protected her from the truth, adding that silent burden to the weight of their loss. And now, Rourke's shadow had found them again, carried in on the thin shoulders of two desperate children. The connection slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just random charity bringing danger to their door. This was the past, circling back like a vulture. Silas Rourke wasn't just hunting the children. His poison had touched their lives too. The locked room held Caleb's ghost, but this pouch held the specter of the man who had stolen a different future from them, a future that might have saved their son. A knock at the door, sharp, urgent, shattered her horrified reverie. Not Amos's familiar stomp. This was different. Fist on wood. Martha jumped, the brittle note falling from her fingers like a dead leaf. Eliza was instantly on her feet, pushing Jonah behind her, her eyes wild with fear. Martha pressed a hand to her racing heart, forcing herself to move towards the door. She lifted the bar slowly, her hand trembling. No one stood on the porch, only the vast, empty white expanse, glittering cruelly under the weak sun. She stepped out, the cold biting her face, scanning the yard. Nothing. Then her boot crunched on something half buried in the fresh snow just beside the door jamb. Not a rock, a smooth stone, flat and dark, and beneath it, peeking out, the corner of a folded paper. Her breath caught. She bent, numb fingers brushing away the snow. She picked up the stone and the paper, unfolded it. The same rough scrawl. Fresh ink. 2 days. Send them out. Don't make it hard. And beneath the words, crudely drawn in charcoal, a single symbol, a coiled rattlesnake, poised to strike. The folded paper, with its crude, venomous symbol, felt like a live coal in Martha's hand. 2 days. Send them out. Don't make it hard. The words seared her vision. Snow crunched behind her. Amos and Jonah are returning from the barn. Jonah struggling under a half-empty feed sack, his small face earnest beneath the oversized coat. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Martha. She crumpled the note and the dark stone together, shoving them deep into her apron pocket in one swift, furtive movement. She forced a brittle smile onto her face, the effort making her jaw ache. "Get that cold off you," she called, her voice unnaturally bright. "Jonah, you look near frozen. Come warm those hands." Eliza, hovering just inside the doorway, watched Martha's return. She saw the too quick movement into the pocket, the strained smile, the flicker of raw fear beneath the surface. Her own fear, a constant hum since the orphanage gates slammed shut, spiked into a sharp dread. Something happened. Something bad. She instinctively pulled Jonah closer as he stumbled in, his mittens damp, cheeks flushed with cold and effort. Amos followed, his gaze sweeping the cabin, lingering on Martha's face for a fraction too long. He saw the strain, the ghostly pallor beneath her wind-chapped skin. "Everything all right?" Amos asked, his voice low, stripping off his own gloves. "Fine," Martha breathed, turning quickly to the stove, rattling the kettle unnecessarily. Just startled by a rabbit kicking snow near the door. Foolish. The lie tasted like ash. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not about the note, and certainly not about the pouch, about Rourke's long shadow reaching back 10 years to steal their hope before Caleb even got sick. The knowledge was a crushing weight, a secret she suddenly carried alone. Telling Amos would unleash his protective fury, a force that could shatter the fragile truce in the cabin, maybe send the children fleeing into Rourke's waiting hands, or seal all their fates. She needed time, to think, to breathe. Amos grunted, unconvinced. He moved to the window, peering out towards the bluffs, his brow furrowed. "Rabbit," he muttered, almost himself. Big tracks for a rabbit. He didn't press Martha. Years of shared silence, of grief swallowed whole, had taught him patience, even when suspicion gnawed. The day crawled by, thick with unspoken tension. Martha moved through her chores, sweeping, mending, preparing a thin stew. like an automaton. Her hands trembled slightly. Her gaze kept drifting to the children. To Eliza, sharp-eyed and watchful, her posture perpetually braced for flight. To Jonah, whose silence seemed to deepen, becoming a palpable thing, a well of terror she couldn't fathom. He flinched when Amos dropped a log near the hearth, a violent jerk that sent his spoon clattering. He startled at the sudden cry of a jay outside the window, pressing his hands over his ears, eyes squeezed shut, lost in some internal storm. Eliza was instantly at his side, murmuring low, pulling him against her. "Just a bird, Jonah. Just a noisy old bird. See," she pointed, her voice tight with forced calm. "Out there. Blue." Jonah slowly lowered his hands, his breath coming in ragged hitches, his eyes wide and vacant, seeing something far worse than a jay. Martha watched, her heart aching. That flinch, that terror, it wasn't just orphanage harshness. It spoke of violence witnessed, of darkness etched deep. Not since the men came shouting, since the gunshots in the dark. Eliza's earlier, aborted words echoed in Martha's mind. She stirred the stew, the spoon scraping the pot like an accusation. Rourke's men, the image of the coiled snake on the locket, the symbol Amos had found carved years ago on the doorpost of their abandoned clam shack, merged with the phantom sounds of shouting, gunshots in Jonah's fragile mind. Later, while Amos was outside checking the perimeter again, Martha saw her chance. Eliza was attempting to mend a tear in Jonah's thin shirt, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jonah sat listlessly beside her on the settle, tracing a finger over a whorl in the wood grain. Jonah seems easily startled. Martha ventured carefully, keeping her tone soft, non-accusatory. She sat in the rocking chair, pretending to darn a sock. Eliza's needle stilled. Her gaze lifted, guarded. "He is. Since before the orphanage." Martha pressed gently. Eliza looked down at the shirt in her lap, her jaw tightening. A long moment stretched. The fire crackled. Wind sighed around the eaves. Since the trouble came, she finally whispered, the words barely audible. "Bad men came looking for him." She wouldn't look at Martha. "He hid us in a root cellar. But we heard." Her voice cracked. Jonah saw after. She stopped, the unspeakable horror hanging in the air. After the shouting stopped, after the gunshots, Martha's breath caught. The stew threatened to rise in her throat. He saw. The image was unbearable. A child witnessing what? Murder? Her hand clenched around the darning egg. "Your pa," she said, forcing the words out. "He had dealings with bad men." She couldn't bring herself to say the name. Rourke. Eliza's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with sudden, fierce defensiveness. "He wasn't bad. He got mixed up. Owes money, they said. Or took something that wasn't rightly his. Maybe." The admission seemed torn from her. "He was scared. For us. Try to get away. That's how he got sick." Her voice dropped again. "Caught cold hiding out in the hills. Then the fever took him quick." She looked back at Jonah, her expression softening into raw tenderness. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He leaned in her touch, a silent plea for comfort. "He hasn't talked since that night." Eliza murmured, more to Jonah than Martha. Not a word, just silence. The weight of it pressed down on Martha. Not just orphans, witnesses, targets, hunted because of a dead man's desperate mistake, tangled with the very monster who had stolen Amos's dream and, indirectly, perhaps hastened their own descent into the grief that consumed Caleb. The connection felt like a noose tightening. Amos returned as dusk began to stain the snow purple and gray. His face was graver than usual, etched with cold and something darker. He didn't speak immediately, hanging his coat with deliberate slowness. He walked to the table and placed something small and wooden down with a soft thud. Martha and Eliza both looked. It was a chunk of pine fence post, freshly split, and carved crudely into the pale wood, unmistakable even in the dim light. A coiled rattlesnake. Found it, Amos stated, his voice a low rumble. Nailed to the barn door. Fresh cut, his pale eyes hard as flint, swept from Martha's suddenly bloodless face to Eliza's terrified one. Ain't no rabbit doing that. The cabin plunged into a deeper silence. Jonah whimpered, shrinking back into the settle's corner, pulling his knees to his chest. Eliza moved to shield him, her own fear giving way to a desperate protectiveness. Martha's hand flew to her apron pocket, the crumpled note burning against her leg. Amos's gaze locked onto Martha. "You knew," he said, not a question. The accusation hung heavy. He'd seen her jump, seen the fear when he'd mentioned the tracks. Knew it weren't no animal. "What else you know, Martha? What ain't you saying?" Martha opened her mouth, but no sound came. The secret, the pouch, the note, they choked her. How to tell him that the demon from their past had returned, wearing the faces of these lost children. How to admit she'd hidden it. Eliza watched the exchange, her heart hammering. They're arguing because of us, because of the trouble we brought. The guilt was a physical pain. "We'll leave," she blurted out, standing up, pulling Jonah with her. His eyes were wide saucers of terror. "Tonight, we'll go. We don't bring trouble on good folks." Her voice trembled, but her chin lifted in that familiar, stubborn defiance. "Stop." Amos's voice cracked like a whip, silencing them all. He didn't look at the children. His eyes were still on Martha, demanding an answer. "Martha, now." Martha closed her eyes for a second, gathering the shattered pieces of her courage. She pulled the crumpled note and stone from her pocket. Her hand shook as she smoothed the paper on the table beside the carved snake. The charcoal symbol seemed to writhe in the firelight. "Found this," she whispered, her voice raw. After the knock, on the step, she pointed a trembling finger at the scrawl. "SR, it's him, Amos. Silas Rourke." She took a ragged breath, the next words even harder to force out. "He threatened us before. Years ago, on the West Quarter. That's why we left so sudden. Why we never went back." Her gaze flickered towards the locked door, the symbol of their other loss. "He drove us off that land. That good land, the land that might have." She couldn't finish. Couldn't say Caleb's name in the same breath as Rourke's poison. Amos stared at the note, then at the carved snake on the wood. A terrible understanding dawned on his weathered face, followed by a wave of fury so profound it seemed to make the air vibrate. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. He looked from the note to Martha, then slowly, inexorably, his burning gaze turned towards Eliza and Jonah. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. He knows. He knew about the locket, about her father. He knew they were the reason Rourke's shadow had fallen on this grieving couple again. She saw it in his eyes, the fury at Rourke, yes, but also a terrible, dawning resentment. "You brought the wolf back to our door." The fragile hope of the past 2 days shattered like ice. Amos took a step towards them, not threatening, but purposeful. His voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet, scraped raw with emotion. "Your pa," he said, each word dropping like a stone. "What was his name?" Eliza froze. Jonah pressed his face into her side, trembling violently. The name that was a curse. The name that had gotten them kicked out of St. Agatha's. The name that meant death. She opened her mouth, terror sealing her throat. Before she could force the syllables out, a sound sliced through the tense silence. Not wind, not an animal. A low, mournful whistle. 3 distinct notes, carried clearly on the still, cold air, coming from the direction of the bluffs. Jonah's reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. He tore himself from Eliza with a strangled, guttural cry, the first sound beyond a whimper he'd made in years. Pure, unadulterated terror contorted his face. He scrambled backwards, knocking over a stool, his eyes wild, fixed on a shuttered window as if the devil himself stood outside. His small hands clawed at his ears, a silent scream locked in his throat. He knew that whistle. It was the sound that had pierced the root cellar darkness. The sound that had come before. Jonah's cry, raw and guttural, hung in the cabin air like shattered glass. It wasn't just sound. It was the eruption of years of buried terror. He thrashed, wild-eyed, clawing at the air, at his ears, as if trying to physically tear the memory of that whistle away. His small body convulsed with silent screams, his face a mask of pure, primal fear. The whistle, the sound that had sliced through the root cellar darkness, the herald of violence and loss, had ripped through his fragile silence. Eliza lunged for him, wrapping her arms around his trembling form, pulling him tight against her chest. Jonah, say ch. He's not here. He's not inside. Her voice was frantic, laced with her own terror, but she held him firm, rocking him, burying his face in her shoulder to muffle his choked gasps. Just the wind playing tricks. The lie was thin, desperate. They all knew. Silas Rourke was out there, close, and he'd just announced his presence in the cruelest way possible. Amos stood frozen for a heartbeat, the fury that had burned towards Martha, and the children momentarily eclipsed by the visceral horror of Jonah's reaction. His pale eyes, wide with shock, darted from the boy's agony to the shuttered window, then back to Martha. The crumpled note on the table, the carved snake on the wood, they pulsed with new, terrifying meaning. This wasn't just about a stolen claim years ago. This was personal, vicious, aimed at the heart of a child. Martha felt the world tilt. Jonah's terror was a physical blow, confirming every dreadful suspicion the pouch and the note had sown. Rourke wasn't just a shadow from their past. He was a monster hunting children, and he'd touched their lives, poisoning their past, and now threatened to destroy this fragile present. The weight of her hidden knowledge, the pouch, the SR note threatening them years ago, pressed down, suffocating. Amos's furious gaze demanded answers she wasn't ready to give, not with Jonah breaking apart in Eliza's arms. "Get him calm," Amos growled, the command rough but stripped of its earlier accusation. He moved to the window, rifle already in hand, peering through a crack in the shutter into the deepening twilight. The vast, snow-covered yard lay still, empty, deceptively peaceful. The whistle had stopped as abruptly as it began. Martha forced her trembling legs to move. She fetched a dipper of water, her hands shaking so badly water sloshed over the rim. She knelt beside Eliza and Jonah. "Here, child," she murmured, her voice thick. Small sips. She held the dipper to Jonah's lips, but he only whimpered, his body rigid with remembered terror. Martha's heart clenched. She touched his hair, a gesture awkward with years of disuse, yet filled with a sudden, fierce protectiveness that momentarily eclipsed her fear. This child saw darkness. This child carries the weight we only ran from. Eliza met Martha's gaze over Jonah's head. The girl's eyes were pools of guilt and desperation. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "We didn't know. We didn't mean to bring him here. To you." Her gaze flickered to Amos's rigid back. "Pa, he stole something." From Rourke. Amos turned slowly, his expression unreadable in the gloom. "Stole what?" Eliza swallowed hard, holding Jonah tighter. "Gold. A small Pope, Pa said. Nuggets. Found it," he claimed, on a claim Rourke said was his. Pa thought finders keepers. Rourke didn't see it that way. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He came with men, shouting, demanding it back. Pa tried to run with us, hid us in the cellar, but they found him." She stopped, the memory choking her. Jonah flinched violently against her, a low moan escaping him. After the shouting stopped, the shots, we crawled out. Her voice was barely audible now. "Pa was gone. The Pope was gone too. We just ran, kept running, till the orphanage." The cabin was silent except for Jonah's ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire. Martha felt sick. Stolen gold. A dead man. Children hunted like animals. And Rourke, a venomous snake, had tracked them here, drawn to the meager shelter they'd found, bringing his poison into a home already steeped in grief. Amos's knuckles were white on the rifle stock. "Finders keepers," he muttered, the words bitter. "Ain't no such thing with Silas Rourke. What's in the ground is his. What's above it too, if he wants it." He looked at Jonah, still trembling, then at Eliza, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. The resentment hadn't vanished, but it was now tangled with a grim understanding. They were all caught in Rourke's web. "That locket," Amos stated flatly, his eyes boring into Eliza. "The one with the snake. Your pa's." Eliza froze. She hadn't realized he knew. Her hand instinctively went to her hidden satchel. "Yes," she whispered. "Only thing of his we got left. Ma's picture was inside once, but it's gone now. Just him, and that mark. Proof," Amos said, the word heavy with dread. "Proof Rourke wants buried, along with anyone who carries it." He turned back to the window, his posture radiating a new, grim resolve. "Bar the door after me. Don't open it for anything but my voice." "Clear." "Amos, no," Martha protested, rising. "It's dark. He's out there. Need to check the stock. Secure the barn." His voice brooked no argument. 2 days, the note said. He's set to end the stage. Wants us scared. Wants us to hand him over easy. He pulled on his heavy coat, his movements deliberate. "Ain't happening. Not tonight." He met Martha's terrified gaze. "Bar it." The heavy thud of the bar dropping into place after Amos left echoed like a tomb ceiling. Martha leaned her forehead against the cold wood, listening to his footsteps crunch away into the snowy silence. The fear was a living thing coiling in her chest. Rourke was out there. Amos was out there. And in this fragile cabin, 2 terrified children and the crushing weight of a secret she still carried alone. She turned. Eliza had managed to coax Jonah onto the settle. He sat huddled, knees drawn up, staring blankly at the fire, but the violent trembling had subsided into a profound, exhausted stillness. Eliza sat beside him, one arm around his shoulders, her own eyes hollow. The firelight caught the tracks of silent tears on her cheeks. Martha's gaze drifted, almost against her will, to the locked door. Caleb's room, the epicenter of their grief. Amos's journal. The thought struck her like lightning. Amos, stoic Amos, who swallowed his pain whole, he'd written. In the early days after Caleb, when words were impossible, he'd scratched his anguish on a paper in that room. Did he write about the West Quarter? About Rourke's threat? About the despair that followed their flight? The pouch she'd found, it was part of that story. Their story, tangled now with the children's. A desperate need seized her. To understand. To find the missing pieces of their past that Rourke had shattered. Maybe, just maybe, it held a clue, a weakness, something beyond the paralyzing fear. She couldn't tell Amos she'd found the pouch, not now. But she could look. In his room, where his grief lived. "Eliza," Martha said, her voice unnaturally calm. "Keep an eye on the fire and listen for Amos." She moved towards the kitchen area, picking up the small oil lamp. Her hands were steady now, driven by a strange, cold purpose. Eliza watched her, wary. "Where you going?" Martha didn't answer directly. She walked towards the locked door in the corner. The heavy iron key was still in the lock, untouched for years. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with dust and memory. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. It turned with a reluctant, grinding shriek that made Jonah flinch. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a wave of stale, cold air and the faint, ghostly scent of dried wildflowers and boyhood. Martha lifted the lamp. The small room was a time capsule. A narrow bed, neatly made with a faded quilt. A small wooden chest at its foot. A shelf with a few carved wooden animals. A horse, a dog, rough but cherished. A primer book. A slingshot. Dust lay thick on everything. A shroud over a life cut brutally short. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was sacred ground, forbidden. But Rourke had violated their peace. She needed answers. Setting the lamp on the small chest, she knelt. Her hands trembled as she opened the lid. Inside were folded clothes, too small, carefully preserved. A knitted cap. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, she found it. Amos's journal. A simple, leather-bound book, its pages thick and yellowing. She sank onto the dusty floorboards, the journal heavy in her lap. The lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, ghosts of the past mingling with the present terror. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Amos's strong, angular script filled the pages, the ink faded in places. Grief poured from the words, raw and immediate, detailing Caleb's fever, the helplessness, the crushing silence after. She skimmed, her eyes burning, searching for mentions of the move, of the West Quarter. Then she found it. An entry dated shortly before Caleb fell ill. Rode out to Black Creek parcel today. Good water. Grass knee-high. Place feels right. Martha's eyes lit up seeing it. Our future's here. I feel in my bones. Filed the papers myself in Helena. Got the notice back. It's ours. Ours. Told Martha tonight. She near cried. Caleb chattered all evening about the fish he'd catch. Felt like hope. Real hope. For the first time since always. Then, coming back from checking the south fence line, found it. Nailed right to the cabin door. A chunk of wood, carved with that damn snake. And a note. SR, no words needed. The snake says it all. Felt the cold dread settle in my gut. Hope's a fragile thing. Too fragile for snakes. Martha's breath caught. Before Caleb got sick, Rourke's threat had stolen their joy, their security, before the fever took their son. She turned the page, frantic. Can't shake the feeling of being watched. Martha's jumpy. Caleb asks why we don't go back to the fish creek. Told him soon. Might taste bad. Saw tracks yesterday. Not ours, circling the cabin. Deep snow but clear. Shot horse. Big. Told Martha it was just a drifter. Another lie. Rourke's men. Letting us know. We ain't safe. This land, it's poison now. Feels like we're waiting for what? For him to burn us out? Hurt Martha? Caleb? The fear, it's eating me alive. Can't farm, can't think, just watch the tree line. What kind of man lets a snake drive him off his own land? What kind of father brings his family into this? The words blurred. Tears streamed down Martha's face, hot and silent. She'd known Amos was worried, stressed about the move he suddenly insisted on, but she'd attributed it to the usual hardships, the bleakness of winter. She hadn't known about the tracks, the constant, gnawing fear Amos had shouldered alone. She hadn't known the depth of his despair, his feeling of failure as a protector. The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, had it weakened Caleb, made him more susceptible? Had Rourke's venom, in stealing their peace and security, contributed to their son's death? The thought was a fresh, agonizing wound. She turned another brittle page. A later entry, the handwriting more ragged, dated after they'd moved to this barren plot, after Caleb was gone. Buried my boy today, in hard, cold ground. Martha, she's like a ghost. The cabin by Black Creek, the dream, feels like a lifetime ago. A lifetime stolen. By the snake. By my own cowardice. If I'd stood my ground, fought, maybe the clean air, the good water, maybe Caleb, maybe he'd have fought the fever harder. Maybe he'd still be. God forgive me. I ran. I saved our hides and lost our boy. The snake wins. It always wins. A sob escaped Martha's throat, muffled by her hand. Amos blamed himself. He linked their flight, their lost hope, directly to Caleb's death. Rourke hadn't just stolen their land. He'd stolen their future, their peace, and in Amos's tortured mind, their son's chance at life. The locket, the stolen gold, the children, they weren't just bringing Rourke's shadow. They were forcing Amos to confront the most devastating failure of his life, the wound Rourke had inflicted a decade ago that had never healed. Suddenly, a sharp, splintering crack echoed from outside. Not wind, not an animal. The unmistakable report of a rifle shot. Then silence. Thicker, more terrifying than before. The rifle shot cracked the frozen night, a sound as sharp and final as bone snapping. Inside the cabin, the silence that followed was absolute, deeper than before, thick with suspended breath and the echo of dread. Martha froze on Caleb's dusty floor, Amos's journal open in her lap, the damning words about Rourke's poison and Amos's guilt still burning her eyes. The shot, outside, where Amos was, where Rourke was. A strangled whimper escaped Jonah, his eyes wide and blank, staring past Eliza's shoulder towards the front of the cabin. Eliza clutched him, her own face bloodless, every muscle coiled to spring, to run, but trapped by the barred door and the terrifying unknown beyond it. Her gaze locked with Martha's across the dim room, a shared bolt of pure terror. Then, heavy, stumbling footsteps, crunching through snow, coming closer, too fast, not Amos's deliberate tread. Eliza shoved Jonah behind her, backing them both towards the darkest corner near the hearth, her eyes darting wildly for a weapon, finding only the iron poker. Martha scrambled to her feet, the journal tumbling forgotten to the floor. She snatched the oil lamp, its flame guttering wildly, and lunged towards the main room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps reached the porch, a heavy thud against the door. Then Amos's voice, rough, strained, but unmistakable. "Martha, open up, now." Relief, cold and dizzying, washed over Martha. She fumbled with the heavy bar, her fingers numb with fear. It clattered to the floor. She yanked the door open. Amos half fell inside, stumbling against the doorframe. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat. His face was pale beneath the weathering, his eyes wide and fierce. He wasn't holding his rifle. He slammed the door shut behind him, throwing the bar back into place with a force that shook the frame. He leaned against it, breathing hard, his chest heaving. "Amos," Martha gasped, reaching for him. "You're hurt." "And no," he rasped, pushing himself upright. "Near thing. Shot came from the bluffs. Whistled past my ear. Took cover behind the water trough. Saw him. Just a shadow against the snow line. Then gone." He wiped his face with a gloved hand that trembled slightly. "Warning shot. Or a damn bad aim. Don't matter. He's playing with us." Tightened in the coil, his pale eyes swept the room, landing on Eliza and Jonah huddled in the corner. Jonah was trembling violently again, his face buried against Eliza's side. Eliza held the poker loosely, her knuckles white, her expression a mixture of terror and fierce resolve. "He knows we're here," Eliza whispered, her voice cracking. "He knows we won't just walk out." Her gaze darted to Martha. "The shot, it was because of us. Because you took us in." Amos pushed off the door, his movements stiff with adrenaline and cold. He walked towards the fire, ignoring the poker in Eliza's hand. "Shot was caused Rourke's snake," he stated flatly. He stopped before Martha, his gaze intense, searching her face. "You were in Caleb's room." It wasn't a question. He'd seen the open door, the lamplight spilling from it when he rushed in. Martha flinched. The pouch, the journal, the crushing truth she'd uncovered. The weight of it pressed down, impossible to bear alone any longer. "Amos," she breathed, her voice thick with tears. I found something. Before. In the chest." She fumbled in her apron pocket, pulling out the old tobacco pouch. She spilled its contents onto the rough-hewn table beside the carved snake post and the crumpled note. The dried flakes, the brass button, and the brittle piece of paper with the faded SR scrawl. Amos stared at it. Recognition, then a wave of profound weariness mixed with fury washed over his face. "Where?" "In the oak chest, with the blankets." Martha's voice trembled. "And the journal, Amos. I read about the West Quarter, about the snake on the door, the tracks, the fear." She took a shuddering breath. "You blamed yourself. For Caleb. You thought if we'd stayed, Amos closed his eyes for a second, a muscle working in his jaw. When he opened them, the grief was raw, laid bare. "Rourke stole more than land, Martha," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "He stole the peace we needed, the strength. Maybe it made a difference. Maybe it didn't, but the poison was his." He picked up the brittle SR note from the table, the one threatening their past claim. His fingers tightened, crumpling it further. And he's back, pouring fresh poison. He looked from the old note to the new one with the charcoal snake. Same snake, same man. His gaze shifted to Eliza. "Your pa stole gold. We stole hope. Rourke don't forgive thieves. He exterminates him." He pointed a thick finger at the locket, knowing it lay hidden in her satchel. That's his brand. Proof he was bested, even for a moment. He wants it erased, along with anyone who knows it exists. Eliza felt the cold metal of the locket beneath her fingers where they clutched Jonah. Proof. Death warrant. Her father's desperate gamble that had cost him his life and now threatened everyone she cared for. The fragile kindness she'd found here, it couldn't end in blood because of her. "We'll go," she said, her voice suddenly clear, strong. "Now, in the dark. We'll draw him away. You've done enough. More than enough." She started to pull Jonah towards the door. "No!" The word tore from Martha. She stepped forward, blocking their path, her earlier fear replaced by a fierce, maternal certainty born of shared pain. "You walk out that door. He picks you off before you reach the tree line. Or worse." She looked at Amos, a silent plea passing between them. Years of quiet grief, the weight of Caleb's empty room, the fresh terror of Rourke. It all coalesced into one undeniable truth. These children, hunted and broken, were theirs now. A second chance, a fragile hope blooming in poison ground. "No one's alone anymore," Martha said, her voice firm. She turned to Eliza. "We face him together, or not at all." Amos gave a single, slow nod. The resentment was gone, burned away by the shared enemy and the raw vulnerability of the boy still trembling against Eliza. Jonah, Caleb's ghost, and a living child needing protection. "She's right," Amos rumbled. He walked to the mantel, took down his rifle, and began methodically checking the load. "Rourke wants the locket, wants the boys silenced, wants the girl gone. He ain't getting any of it." He looked at Eliza. "That locket, you said your ma's picture was gone. Just your pa. Anything else in it? Anything Rourke might want more than just seeing it destroyed?" Eliza hesitated. She guarded the locket's secret fiercely. But Martha's words, Amos's resolve, they chipped at the wall of her distrust. Slowly, she reached into her satchel, her fingers finding the cold metal beneath the torn lining. She pulled it out. The tarnished silver felt heavy, malevolent. The coiled rattlesnake seemed to gleam in the firelight. She fumbled with the tiny clasp. It sprang open. Inside, one side held the blurred, unsmiling image of her father. The other side was empty, the felt backing worn thin. "Just him," Eliza whispered. She held it out towards the light. "See? Nothing." Amos stepped closer, peering at the empty side. Martha joined him. The worn felt looked uneven, lumpy. Martha's finger, almost of its own accord, reached out and touched the backing. It wasn't smooth. There was something beneath it, a slight bulge. "Eliza," Martha breathed. The backing, feel it. Frowning, Eliza pressed her finger against the worn felt inside the locket. Martha was right. There was something hard and flat beneath the fabric. Her heart leapt in her throat. With trembling fingers, careful not to damage the fragile image of her father, she picked at the edge of the felt backing. It lifted slightly, glued only at the corners. Beneath it, pressed into a shallow recess in the metal, lay a tiny, tightly folded square of paper. Eliza carefully extracted it. Her hand shook as she unfolded it on the table, smoothing the creases beside the carved snake post and Rourke's notes. It was a crude, hand-drawn map. Faint pencil lines sketched jagged peaks, a winding creek labeled Black Creek, and an X marked near a distinctive, lightning-blasted pine tree. Beside the X, in her father's recognizable, cramped handwriting, was a single word: cash. Black Creek. Amos breathed, his voice tight with recognition. The West Quarter. Our land. His claim now likely. He stabbed a finger at the map. The gold. He hid it. Didn't spend it. Didn't give it back. Hit on Rourke's own claim. A grim, almost savage understanding lit his eyes. That's why Rourke's so hell-bent. It ain't just the theft. It's the insult. Hit under his nose. And this, he tapped the map, is the only way to find it. The locket wasn't just proof. It was the key. The revelation hung in the air. The stolen poke of gold nuggets wasn't spent. It was buried, a final act of defiance by a desperate man. And Rourke, the territorial predator, couldn't abide the thought of it lying hidden on land he considered his, a secret known only by the dead man's children. He needed the map destroyed and the witnesses silenced. Jonah, who had been staring blankly at the map, suddenly made a small, choked sound. He pulled away from Eliza slightly, his eyes wide, fixed on the drawing. He lifted a trembling finger and pointed not at the X, but at a small, almost insignificant squiggle near the creek bend, a shape like a crooked tooth. His lips moved, soundless at first, then a rasping whisper, thin as smoke, escaped. Sea cave. Eliza gasped. Jonah? What did you say? She knelt before him, cupping his face. Cave? You remember? Jonah nodded jerkily, his eyes filled with a sudden, painful clarity. Papa hid there, with Poke, before the bad man. He shuddered, the memory surfacing like a nightmare. Whistle, then shouts. He buried his face back against Eliza, the effort of speech exhausting him. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. Amos stared at the boy, then at the map, a new plan hardening in his eyes. The cave, a potential refuge, a trap, but knowledge, power. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tense silence inside the cabin. Not a whistle, not a shot, a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the glass of the cabin's single window. They all froze. Martha's blood turned to ice. Eliza instinctively shoved Jonah behind her back, grabbing the poker again. Amos snatched up his rifle, cocking it with a sharp click that echoed like doom. Slowly, agonizingly, they turned towards the sound. Outside, pressed against the cold glass, distorted by frost and grime, but horrifyingly clear, was a face. A man's face, hard-planed, weathered like old saddle leather, framed by a dark, wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Cold, pitiless eyes, reflecting the flickering firelight inside, scanned the room. They lingered on the table where the map lay open beside the carved snake and the notes. Then they moved, locking onto Eliza, then Jonah, with a predator's focus. A gloved hand lifted, not holding a gun. The index finger tapped the glass again. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, insistent. Then the hand turned, palm facing inward. On the middle finger, a heavy silver ring gleamed. Engraved upon it, unmistakable even through the dirty glass, was the coiled form of a rattlesnake. The tapping stopped. The hand lowered. Silas Rourke's voice, low, gravelly, and carrying an unnerving calm, filtered through the thin pane, freezing the very air inside the cabin. Time's up.